In the heart of Tennessee's mountains stands a stone beast the locals called the end of the road, Brushy Mountain State Prison. They built it to hold the most dangerous men alive, but they say the real jailer wasn't the guards or the walls, but the ancient, unforgiving mountain itself. The official history tells of riots, brutality, and the escape of America's most hated man. But the old tales whisper of something darker, a curse born of blood and coal, one that traps souls within its stones long after their sentences have ended. Today, we'll peel back the layers of time and fear to ask, what really happened inside the prison that the mountain would never let go? Before the first stone of Brushy Mountain was laid, before its shadow fell across the valley, this was a different world. The Cumberland Mountains weren't a cage, they were a sanctuary. Life here moved to the rhythm of the seasons, dictated by the rising sun and the flow of the creeks. Families lived in cabins tucked into deep hollows, surrounded by forests so thick they seemed to swallow the sky. It was a hard life, to be sure, carved out of rock and stubborn soil, but it was a life of profound freedom. The men of this place were miners, but they were free men. Every morning, they'd walk into the dark mouths of the earth, not in chains, but with a lunch pail in one hand and a pickaxe in the other. This work was brutal, dangerous, and it stole the breath from their lungs, but it was honest. It was how they fed their children and kept a fire in the hearth. They were bound not by guards, but by a powerful, unspoken code of community. They looked out for one another because in the deep dark, your neighbor was the only law that mattered. They were a proud and independent people, descendants of Scots-Irish settlers who had come to these mountains seeking solitude and a life of their own making. They asked for little from the outside world and wanted even less from its governments. Their wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the yield of their gardens, the strength of their families, and the unshakable knowledge that this land, these hills, these creeks, belonged to them. They had everything they needed. But far away from these quiet hollows, in the halls of power, men with ledgers and contracts were drawing lines on maps. They saw the rich seams of coal not as a lifeline for mountain families, but as fuel for a new industrial age. And to get that fuel as cheaply as possible, they were willing to make a deal with the devil. A plan was being hatched, a monstrous idea that would turn the state's prisons into a source of cheap labor. A rumor began to snake through the mountains, a whisper of a new kind of miner coming to the creeks, a miner who worked in chains and who would take the very bread from their tables. The world they knew was about to be burned to the ground. The ground for this conflict had been fertile for generations. The people of the mountains had a long and bitter memory when it came to outsiders with promises and contracts. They remembered their grandfathers telling stories of timber barons who stripped the hills bare and left, and land agents who tricked men who couldn't read into signing away their mineral rights for a pittance. So when the coal companies arrived, they were viewed with a deep, ingrained suspicion. The company men, with their clean hands and city suits, were a different breed, and their promises of prosperity always seemed to come with a hidden cost. This new threat, the convict lease system, was an echo of those old grievances. It wasn't just about jobs, it was about dignity. The miners saw it as a deliberate slap in the face, a message from the state and the companies that their hard, dangerous labor was worth so little it could be replaced by the forced toil of prisoners. It was, in their eyes, a different kind of slavery being brought to their doorstep, designed to break their unions and grind them into submission. The old wound of being seen as backward and expendable by the outside world was torn open once again. The talk started in whispers, carried from one mining camp to the next. A man would come over the ridge from Coal Creek with news, his voice low and urgent as he shared what he'd heard. At first, it was just rumors. They're building a stockade up by the Briceville mine. Heard they signed a contract with the state for 100 men. At the company store, at church gatherings, around the fire at night, the whispers grew into a steady, angry murmur. Soon, the talk started to curdle. Fear and speculation twisted the facts into something monstrous. 100 convicts became 500. A plan to supplement the workforce became a plot to replace them all. Every word was like a piece of dry kindling, carefully stacked at the miners' doorsteps. The convicts themselves, men they had never seen, were no longer viewed as unfortunate souls. They became a faceless symbol of the miners' own impending starvation, the instrument of their destruction. The community, once bound by solidarity, was now bound by a shared and growing rage. The fuse that had been sputtering for months was finally lit in the summer of 1891. The Tennessee Coal Mining Company, emboldened by the state's backing, made its move. They fired their free miners at Briceville, evicted them from their company-owned homes, and marched in a new workforce, convicts in black and white stripes, shackled and under the watch of armed guards. This was no longer a threat whispered in the shadows. It was a reality, stark and brutal. Men who had spent their lives in the mines were now cast out, watching from the hills as prisoners took their place. The initial reaction was a wave of cold, silent fury. That night, in a secluded hollow, lit only by the flickering light of torches, hundreds of miners gathered. You could see the resolve hardening in their eyes. These were not men given to idle threats. They were men of action, pushed to the absolute edge. They didn't speak of protest or petitions. They spoke of taking back what was theirs. A decision was made, a pact sealed not with a handshake, but with the grim nodding of heads and the quiet cleaning of rifles. They would not stand by and starve. Before dawn on July 14th, 300 armed miners descended from the mountains, moving like ghosts through the morning mist. They surrounded the convict stockade at Briceville. There was no shouting, no chaotic mob. This was a disciplined, determined force. They presented their ultimatum to the guards: surrender the stockade and the prisoners, or face the consequences. The guards, looking out at the sea of determined faces and the barrels of hundreds of rifles glinting in the twilight, knew they stood no chance. They surrendered without a shot being fired. But what happened next stunned the authorities. The miners didn't harm the convicts. They saw them not as enemies, but as fellow victims of a corrupt system. They broke open the stockade, gave the prisoners food and civilian clothes, and marched them to the nearest train station. They put them on a train and sent them to Knoxville with a simple, defiant message for the governor. We will not work alongside convicts, and we will not allow them to work here. They had committed an open act of insurrection. They had drawn a line in the coal dust, and in doing so had declared war on the state of Tennessee. There was no turning back now. The first move had been made, and the entire state held its breath, waiting for the violent reply that was sure to come. The state's answer to the rebellion wasn't a single battle, but a slow, grinding execution of the human spirit. They found their diabolical solution. They would build their own prison with their own mine, and the miners who had defied them would be its first inhabitants, and they would build it themselves. They brought them in chains, not to a finished building, but to the raw, untamed foot of Brushy Mountain. Their first order was to pick up a sledgehammer and attack the very cliffs that would become their tomb. This wasn't a slaughter of bullets and knives. It was a slaughter of exhaustion and despair. The days began before sunrise and ended long after sunset, a relentless rhythm of steel striking stone. The air, thick with grey dust, became a constant shroud, coating their skin, filling their lungs, and turning their desperate coughs into a rasping choir. The only sounds were the sharp crack of the guards' whips against the rock, the groans of men lifting stones beyond their strength, and the rhythmic, hollow clang of hammers that beat like a dying heart. From the nearby hollows, you couldn't see the faces of the men, only their silhouettes against the raw face of the mountain. You'd see them moving like specters in the dust, a long, broken line of humanity being slowly erased. Sometimes, a silhouette would simply falter and disappear, collapsing in a heap. There was no ceremony. The work wouldn't even pause. The others would just keep swinging, their eyes fixed on the stone in front of them, not daring to look at the man who had just been swallowed by the mountain. The mountain itself seemed to be a silent, hungry participant. The stones they quarried were cold and sharp, tearing at their hands until they were raw and bleeding. It was as if the mountain was demanding a price, and the mortar that would hold the walls together was a mixture of sand, water, and the sweat and blood of these men. Every stone they lifted was soaked in their misery. Every block they set in place was a monument to their stolen freedom. With their own bleeding hands, they built their tomb, stone by agonizing stone. They watched the walls rise around them, a grey tide of granite that blotted out the trees, the sky, and any last sliver of hope. They were building their own cage, and they knew it. The final act of this slaughter was not a gunshot, but a sound. The deafening clang of a massive iron gate swinging shut for the very first time. The lock turned, and the men who had built the fortress were now its first official prisoners. Their rebellion was over. Their world was gone, and the mountain had them. When the last stone was set and the great iron gate slammed shut, a new kind of silence fell over the valley. It was not the peaceful quiet of the mountains. It was a silence so deep it had weight, pressing down on the men inside and the hollows outside. The dust of construction settled, revealing the finished prison not as a building, but as a scar of grey stone carved into the green landscape. The Coal Creek War was over. The rebellion was crushed, and for the men who had fought for their freedom, the world had shrunk to the space between four stone walls. Inside, they were no longer miners or rebels. They were stripped of their names, their clothes, their pasts, and given a number and a striped uniform. The fight for justice was replaced by a grim, daily struggle for survival. And in the cruelest twist of fate, the state opened its own coal mine right on the prison grounds. The very thing they had fought against, being forced to work in a mine to enrich the state, had become their life sentence. They now descended into the earth each day, not as free men, but as the state's property, digging the black heart out of the mountain that held them captive. For those who survived the mines, a new society began to form within the walls, governed by its own brutal laws. The guards were kings, their word absolute, and their fists the only justice. The slightest infraction could land a man in the hole, a pitch-black cell deep in the foundations, a place where the damp chill and total darkness were designed to strip away not just hope, but sanity itself. A hierarchy of violence took root among the inmates, and the men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in rebellion now looked at each other with suspicion and fear. Outside, in the surrounding communities, the prison stood as a constant, terrifying monument to their defeat. The mountain had swallowed their husbands, their sons, their fathers. The spirit of defiance that had burned so brightly was extinguished, replaced by a pervasive fear. Families spoke of the men in Brushy Mountain in hushed whispers, as if the very walls had ears. The fortress had not only imprisoned the rebels, it had put a stranglehold on the spirit of the entire region. The authorities had won. Brushy Mountain became their grim trophy, a symbol of absolute power and a chilling warning to anyone who would dare to challenge the system again. The rumors that bled out from behind the walls, tales of brutality, of men lost in the mines, of souls broken in the dark, only served their purpose, cementing the prison's reputation as the end of the road. A new, dark chapter had begun, written in coal dust and human despair. The state's response was not to send lawmen, it was to send an army. The Tennessee State Militia, hundreds of them, descended upon the mountains by train. They were flatlanders, boys from the cities and farms, clad in uniforms that stood out starkly against the deep greens and browns of the forest. They came not to investigate a crime, but to put down an insurrection. Local sheriffs and deputies, men who had grown up with the miners, were brushed aside. This was no longer a local dispute. It was a military occupation. Their orders were simple: hunt down the leaders of the rebellion and make an example of them. But the miners had vanished. They melted back into the landscape that had birthed them, becoming ghosts in their own land. They knew every hidden hollow, every game trail, every forgotten cave and abandoned mine shaft. The mountains that had been their home now became their fortress, a vast, tangled labyrinth where they held every advantage. The militia, accustomed to open fields and city streets, were utterly lost here. The mountains themselves fought against them with steep ridges, sudden ravines, and a disorienting wilderness that seemed to change with the light. The hunt became a brutal, nerve-wracking game of cat and mouse. Patrols of soldiers would march up the creeks, their movements clumsy and loud, while the men they were hunting watched silently from the high ground. A snapping twig, a bird call that sounded just a little off, these were the signals that passed between the hidden men. A silent war was waged in the shadows, a war of fear and attrition. The militia, frustrated and angry, turned their attention to the families left behind. They raided cabins in the dead of night, tearing homes apart in search of fugitives, their bayonets a constant threat meant to break the mountain people's code of silence. But that code ran deeper than fear. Hiding a man on the run wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a sacred duty. A network of whispers and secret signs kept the fugitives fed and informed. A lantern left burning in a specific window, a quilt of a certain pattern hung on a clothesline. These were the messages the soldiers couldn't read. For months, the community held fast, a wall of silence and deception against the invaders. Eventually, though, the siege began to take its toll. A winter in the mountains is long, and hunger is a powerful persuader. The state posted bounties, turning the price of a man's freedom into a bag of flour and a few dollars, a fortune for a starving family. Slowly, agonizingly, the wall of silence began to crack. One by one, the leaders were found. They were discovered not in a blaze of gunfire, but huddled by a low fire in an abandoned prospecting cabin, their faces gaunt with hunger. They were cornered in the dark tunnels of a played-out mine, surrendering with the quiet exhaustion of men who know their road has come to an end. There was no fight left in them. In their eyes was not the fire of rebellion, but the cold ash of defeat. They were bound in chains and marched down from the hills, often past their own homes, where their wives and children watched in stoic silence. Their long, desperate hunt in the shadows was over, and they all knew where they were going next. They were being taken back to the stone monster they had built, this time to be fed into its belly. The trials, when they came, were not about discovering truth. They were a public ritual of humiliation, a final breaking of the miner's spirit. The leaders of the rebellion were marched in chains into county courthouses packed to the rafters. On one side sat their families, women and children with faces carved from stone, their eyes holding a silent, defiant grief. On the other side were the company men in their starched collars and the state officials, their expressions a mixture of triumph and contempt. The air was thick with a tension you could taste, held in check only by the armed militia who lined the walls, their presence a constant reminder of who held the power now. The miners themselves sat in the dock, not with the downcast eyes of criminals, but with a quiet, exhausted dignity. These were not men who understood the intricate language of the law. They understood the simple justice of the mountains. You don't let your family starve. They listened as slick city prosecutors, using words they barely recognized, painted them as anarchists and violent insurrectionists, a threat to civilization itself. They were accused of destroying property, but the property in question was the state's right to the labor of other human beings. The proceedings were a tragic farce. Witnesses were brought forth, men whose will had been broken or whose loyalty had been bought with a bounty. The defense was a token effort, a whisper against a hurricane of state power. The jury, often composed of merchants and landowners who benefited from the company's presence, listened with closed faces and closed hearts. The real verdict had been decided months before, not in a jury room, but in the governor's mansion and the coal company's boardroom. When the foreman finally stood to read the verdict, there was no gasp of surprise. Guilty. The word fell into the silent room like a stone into a deep well. There were no tears from the families, only a tightening of jaws. The company men exchanged quiet, satisfied nods. The defendants themselves simply stared ahead, their faces betraying nothing. They had known from the moment the chains were locked on their wrists that this was the only possible outcome. Their freedom was gavelled away, their fight officially declared a crime. But the final, cruelest blow was the sentence. The judge, a man who saw them not as desperate fathers, but as a disease to be cured, condemned them to years of hard labor. And in a moment of supreme, calculated irony, he sentenced them to serve that time at the new Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. They were being sent back to the stone monster they had been forced to build, to work the state's coal mine under the very system they had risked their lives to destroy. Was it justice? Or was it merely the law of the powerful, a tool to crush the desperate and sanctify the cruel? The mountains had their own code of right and wrong, but on that day, the law of men had spoken, and its voice was the sound of a prison gate slamming shut. Today, you can drive right up to the gates of Brushy Mountain. It's a tourist attraction. You can take a guided tour, eat at a restaurant called the Warden's Table, and even buy moonshine legally distilled on the very grounds where men were once broken. Tourists smile for photos, posing in the cell that once held James Earl Ray, their laughter echoing in the same spaces that once held only despair. It is a strange, surreal carnival built on a foundation of forgotten pain. But if you look past the gift shop and the polished exhibits, the echoes of that first desperate fight are still there. Run your hand along the cold, grey stones of the outer wall. You're touching the very blocks that were quarried and hoisted into place by the exhausted, bleeding hands of the Coal Creek rebels. The prison itself is their truest, most terrible monument. Most of those men never saw the outside world again. They died in the prison mine, their lungs choked with coal dust, or they simply withered away in the hole. Their names are largely lost to history, etched only on the crumbling pages of forgotten ledgers. But their bloodlines still run through these hollows. Their great-grandchildren still live on the same land, and in their families, the story of the war is passed down not as history, but as a quiet, stubborn legend of defiance. The physical traces are scattered across the landscape like old bones. In the woods around the prison, there are patches of unmarked graves, simple field stones marking the final resting places of convicts the state didn't bother to send home. The old mine portals, the very ones the rebels worked, are still visible as dark, collapsed scars on the mountainside, sealed with concrete but still seeming to exhale a cold, dead air. A few miles away, near the town once called Coal Creek, a small metal plaque now stands, officially acknowledging the conflict. It's a quiet, understated nod to a war that once set these mountains on fire. Most people who drive past that sign have no idea what it means. The story has been paved over by new roads and drowned out by the noise of the modern world. But when the last tour bus leaves Brushy Mountain for the day and the sun sinks behind the ridge, the old silence returns. And in that silence, you can feel it. The wind whistling through the empty cell blocks sounds like a whisper. The chill that settles in the valley has nothing to do with the weather. The tourists may forget the story as soon as they drive away, but the stones of this prison have not. The mountain remembers everything. So we return to the question that hangs in the cold air of this valley. What is the real curse of Brushy Mountain? Is it the restless spirit of a long-dead inmate, or the shadows that flicker in empty cells? The truth, as it so often is in these mountains, is something far more human and therefore far more chilling. The curse of Brushy Mountain was not born of supernatural forces. It was forged in the fire of human greed and ratified by the cold hand of injustice. The prison wasn't just built on a foundation of stone. It was built on the ashes of a people's rebellion for the simple right to live with dignity. This is more than just the story of a building. It is a story about the indomitable Appalachian spirit, It's a testament to men who were told their hard lives and their families didn't matter, and who answered by shaking the very foundations of the state. They lost their war, yes. They were chained and broken, and many were buried in unmarked graves. But the memory of their defiance is now embedded in these hills, a lesson that must not be forgotten. That even when the fight seems hopeless, there is a profound power, a profound honor in standing your ground. So the next time you hear the name Brushy Mountain, don't just think of infamous escapees or tales of hauntings. Think of those first prisoners. Think of the free miners of Coal Creek who were forced to build their own tomb, stone by blood-soaked stone. Because their story is the prison's true foundation. It is the secret the mountain has held for over a century. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story.